Shmai, Ellora. You've been a poet in residence at Jane Austen's house and at the Petersfield Museum. How have these experiences shaped your writing practice?
I've been so incredibly lucky with both of those residencies, both the Jane Austen's house and Petersfield Museum and Art Gallery. They were absolutely fantastic experiences, and they have stayed with me since doing them. I think from both of them, I really learned about how processes of research and just giving yourself time just to completely immerse yourself in a subject or a theme can be really fruitful, and that we do deserve to have that time to percolate and let those thoughts happen. Specifically with the Petersfield Museum and Art Gallery, I was looking at responding to the poet Edward Thomas. He was a poet who was killed in the First World War. He's sometimes regarded as a war poet, and I think that is fair, although I'd see him more as a nature poet. You know, I don't think you can just sort of pigeonhole a poet as particularly one kind. But that introduced me to the poetry of Edward Thomas, and that has certainly stayed with me. He was one of the poets who kind of made me stop and think that there's nothing too small or too trivial to be in a poem. You know, he writes about the train being delayed at Adelstrop is his most famous poem, and that's actually quite a modern thing. You know, obviously it's over 100 years old now, but it feels so fresh and new, and I think part of that is he's looking at the minutiae or the things that people might consider to be below their noticing in many respects. And another thing that the residencies, both of them taught me, is the importance of play and exploration, especially when you're introduced to a topic, for example, archaeology, which was a Petersfield one, where you aren't particularly familiar with the jargon or the specific language of that area, and it can be so generative to really get into that language and explore it. And you can find with so many sort of languages like that, like specialist languages, they are full of metaphor and just waiting for poetry, or the poetry's already there, it just needs to be sort of excavated a little bit, to borrow an archaeology metaphor there. Moonshot. Pork chow mein in the park, the meat red-lipped, girlish. My new dress is ruined with sticky red sauce in the shape of an iris. She looks at me, and I have the tiny yet full body of a starling, the size of a whole heart, beating rapidly. I am bones, blue as heaven in her tinfoil carton. I read somewhere once that this planet can only withstand 5 more atomic bombs. This, surely, must be one of them.
How did poetry begin? Do you remember your earliest poems?
I've always loved writing. I was very fortunate in that I had a mum who read to me. She would read to me at night, and she would read stories to me, and I would dictate, before I could write, I would dictate stories to her and she'd write them down for me. But poetry in particular, I was thinking about this. I think the earliest poem that I can remember actually writing was in primary school. And we had to write a poem called A Monster's Breakfast. I think there is actually a poem or a children's book called A Monster's Breakfast, and we had to write our own. And I thought that was just fabulous fun. And you know, poetry can sort of be anything. It can be a menu for a monster's breakfast. It can include all of these crazy things. And then my next memory is doing poetry in GCSE English. I was really lucky. I had an absolutely fabulous English teacher who brought it to life, and I can remember studying, you know, Charlotte Mew, The Farmer's Bride. That's one that really sticks in my head. I loved that. And then again at A-level, I had a brilliant English teacher, studied Carol Ann Duffy, and that was the moment where I was like, this is what poetry can do. This is what I want to do this. And I was writing poetry and writing poems, but I was still kind of thinking, is poetry what I really want to do, or is it something that is kind of like a hobby for me? And it wasn't until my third year at university, I went to University of the Creative Arts in Farnham, where my wonderful lecturer, Claire Griffiths, she said for my final major project, you know, I can't do a bit of poetry and a bit of fiction and whatever, I have to choose one or the other. And I thought about it for a moment, and she said, Ellora, you're a poet, you know, do that. And that's what I did, and I kind of haven't looked back since. It just brings me joy. I love writing poetry. I kind of don't know what I'm doing if I'm not doing that, if that makes sense.
I'm fascinated by your PhD research, which from what I have read is concerned with poetry assessing gender bias in urban planning. Would you please elaborate on what interests you about this research?
Thank you so much for that question. It's still really new and exciting to me because I've only been doing my PhD for the past month, so I started in October, so just over a month now. And it is so exciting to be doing this topic. So it's using psychogeography and women and non-binary people writing the city, specifically focused on London because that's where my university is based. It's Northeastern University London. It's a really beautiful place. It's right by Tower Bridge. It's amazing. And I still can't quite believe that I get to do it. But the thing that excites me and interests me in this particular topic is that psychogeography has interested me for a long time. I was first introduced to it by Craig Jordan Baker, my undergrad lecturer in my first year, and it's really stuck with me since, this idea of place, this sense of place. Partly I think because I've never moved house, you know, I live with my grandparents, this is where I grew up, I've never moved, so I do have a strong sense of place, but then the other side of that is I've always been enchanted by cities. Specifically by London, because I live quite rurally, I live in a village, very small village, and when I was growing up it was always, you know, London was the big day out, and that's kind of interest for me, and to be able to study here and to write about here is amazing. But I came across this long poem, I think it was during a workshop, called Paris, a poem by Hope Merlis from, I think, the very early 1920s, maybe a little bit before that, published by Hogarth Press. And it's incredible the way this woman writes about the city of Paris and how she captures the motion of it and the liveliness of it and the twists and turns of it in so many ways, through the language of course, but also through the shape the poem takes on the page. And that's been something that I've been carrying along. So I've been carrying along this interest in psychogeography, this particular poem, my love of London, and then also I read this book called Invisible Women, which is all about the gender data gap, and it's by, oh my gosh, I can't remember her name. But The Invisible Women is an amazing book, and she speaks about how women's data isn't collected, and that can often impact everyday cities are planned. And I thought, well, this is really interesting. And so that was still sort of there. And then one of my other jobs is that I am the poetry reviewer for Miss Lexia. And I've kind of noticed, and I haven't done any, hard and fast, empirical data on this, but I've kind of noticed sort of an urbanisation of women's poetry. It seems more and more that there are poems being written by women in the urban space or about the urban space. And so that was all there. And then I was introduced to my supervisor, Sam Kemp, who is a wonderful poet and a brilliant supervisor. And it just kind of went from there. And this topic of using poetry as a practice-based research method to assess the impacts of gender bias in urban planning on women and non-binary people in the city. It just feels so right for me. It's what I'm interested in, it's what I'm passionate about. It's fun, which I think is the most important thing. And I just feel so lucky to be doing it.
You seem to be enjoying being at that university, and I wonder if that's rubbing off on sort of your writing.
Oh gosh, I certainly hope so. Because I think, I think if you feel passionate about something, or you whether that's passionate in a good or a bad way, I think it comes through in your poems, or in whatever type of writing or art it is that you produce. And I think my poems of late have been quite joyful. I hope they have been, because I've been feeling joyful. And I think as a place to study, Northeastern Uni is so supportive, and it's so fun, and like I say, it's right in the city, so it's a perfect place to write the city from, and to think about how other people write the city and experience the city. Yeah. Collective noun for birds. I think I am really an aviary, masquerading as a girl. My heart is a wood pigeon. Sometimes I have a swim bladder, and that is a chaffinch. The gulls are restless. They go wherever greediness is. My knees, the back of my neck. Somewhere over my lungs, a heron. I start seeing an ornithologist. She feeds me sunflower seeds and pistachios, warm breadcrumbs from her butter knife, shows me the shapes required for flying. I ask her what will become of the loose net of my body when half or more of the birds want to migrate. She says she doesn't know, but she'd love to observe. She says, a beautiful sky, I'd imagine.
Aspects of pop culture often float through your poems, such as references to the film Titanic, as well as a number of video games. What makes popular culture such a compelling subject and object for you?
I think it goes back to what I was saying. If you're passionate about something, then that will come through in your poems. And if you care about something and you write about it, then people will care about your writing. I guess it kind of goes all the way back to what I was saying about Edward Thomas. It's noticing the things that make up everyday life, and it's nothing is above or below poetry. And I think I write so much about pop culture, or have written so much about pop culture, because it's what I know. And if you think about it, that's what poets have always done. The 1997 Titanic is, my Greek mythology. That's what Keats was writing about, but not Titanic, obviously, but his own Titanic he was writing about. And I think it can go quite a long way in connecting with people. If you write about pop culture is a shared experience, and a poem should also be a shared experience. So when people read a poem and it has references to things they don't necessarily understand, then that can be quite off-putting, if they're not wanting to put in the extra work to sort of research, different things. But if you're writing about something that feels current and contemporary and now, then that can help create a bridge, I think. I know certainly when I've gone into schools in the past and I've shared poems by sort of like Chen Chen, for example. Chen Chen is an amazing poet, and I always try to share one of his poems in a workshop, especially if it's with younger people. And it was I Love You to the Moon and, which is a poem in which he imagines going to the moon and staying up there up on the moon, and he makes references to Sailor Moon and things like that. And I remember sharing that poem at one school in particular, and I just heard this girl in the front row go, "Wow, I didn't know poetry could do that." And it's that moment of realizing that poetry is for you, and poetry is the stuff of everyday life. You can write a poem about anything.
What led to your most recent poetry pamphlet, Artisanal Slush, published by Verve?
So I was very lucky. I went on an online Arvon from home poetry course, and it was led by Cynthia Miller, who is one of my absolute favourite poets, and Stephen Sexton, who's also one of my favourite poets. And it was all about putting play back into poetry. And it wasn't something I'd realised I was necessarily missing, but now that I've found it, or when I found it, I was like, oh my God, this is so fun. Like poetry doesn't always have to be severe, it doesn't have to be heavy subjects. You know, you can write a poem that's as impactful about, you know, Hello Kitty or whatever, as if you were writing about, you know, death and that kind of thing. And so that was a really fruitful at-home writing week for me. I don't think I've ever written so much in 1 week in my life. And I think I came out at the end of that week and I had probably about 75% of what would go into the pamphlet at the end. And I was like, and I recognised that this was a pamphlet, you know, they had that shared theme of sort of pop culture, coming of age, I guess, not taking yourself too seriously. And I realised that they were cohesive in that sense. So I wrote a few more poems for it. I found some that kind of were sort of there already, and I submitted to an open call from Verve Poetry Press, and it went from there. They were beautiful to work with. They still are wonderful to work with. Stuart Bartholomew, the big cheese there, he's a fabulous man, brilliant. And I was really lucky as well because they had, I think it was sort of like an exchange they were doing, and they had the very wonderful and lovely and generous Isabel Baffy. She worked on my manuscript with me. She gave me some brilliantly and again very generous, in-depth feedback. She gave me some poets to go and read. One of them was Morgan Parker, who I just completely fell in love with. I hadn't read Morgan Parker's work before, but I have now. I absolutely adore it. Again, one of those poets who creates a real sense of shared experience and does things, you know, through pop culture as well. Which, yeah, I've been very lucky with the people I've met and been able to work with along the way.
Isabel, of course, is the reviews editor at Poetry London. And
Yes.
I think her first collection is coming up maybe April next year.
Oh, that's
Yes.
exciting.
I had the pleasure and privilege of reviewing her first pamphlet, Ripe, for Poetry Wales maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and she's such a beautiful writer.
Ripe is brilliant, yeah. Ripe is a fabulous pamphlet. In a field on a clear night, I might say, I don't get what a belt is doing up there, in the stars, in the dark. Come show me. Bruise me into a gospel of consent, a manifesto on healing, an art installation called This Is What I Want, Part 1. Sit on the carpet outside your neoclassical marble bathroom whilst I soak, reading out the many 5-star reviews of my performance in the dual role of Courtney Love, John Keats, in my new one-woman musical, Your Teeth Are Only Unbroken Because I Choose It to Be So, in which the entire score was composed by an AI, asked to fantasize a lipstick factory after dark. Prove to me that the best way to increase the longevity of a cut rose is to cut it again and cauterize the stem. Prove that my middle name is Rose, past tense of rise. Raise me. Tell me I am one hot zombie, almost hot enough to be declared legally alive, clinically a miracle. What do I have to offer you? Permission to call me pretty between dreams, to witness my wild dreaming.
I'm fascinated by your poem, Bitch River. Is there a story behind it?
I don't think it's necessarily one cohesive story behind it, because I don't think that would be true for any of my poems, even ones that are drawn from life, and I'm not saying that any or all of them are, as is the poet's privilege. Because I often think of writing a poem, it's like you're putting like a domino mask on. You know, you can be sort of like the masked hero kind of thing. There's a brilliant quote by Phoebe Stucks. She did an interview with, I think it was with Poetry News, and she said that writing a poem was a bit like putting on drag, and that is kind of how I see it. You can be like this this sort of out of this world, sort of larger than life character in your poems. You can be a different person, but there are elements of myself and of truth certainly in Bitch River. I think it started with the second line. You know, everyone's out here doing their best, but some people's best is fucking awful, and that's not my fault. And I'm sure you can probably tell it's a poem drawn from frustration, I guess, in particular that part of it, from frustration of this expectation that you always owe someone forgiveness. Like if they apologise to you, then you should forgive them. And whilst I try to kind of always forgive people, because I think it's, you know, well, is it the right thing to do? Maybe not. You know, some people, you know, you don't feel like you're not in that place yet. And is that a place you should aim to get to? I don't know. But I'm also interested in writing poems about bodies and about water. And I know it sounds really obvious, but you know, you have a body, but then there's also bodies of water, and that's you know, there's got that kind of linguistic similarity, I guess. And that's kind of in that poem too. The most truthful part of it is the bit where I say that I was sick on holiday as a child, you know, so much that all I brought up was bile, and that is true, that happened. I just remember being so sick, and like the red arrows were flying overhead for something, and I was just like looking up and then being sick. But yeah, so that's based on truth. And the title, I didn't know what to call it, so I was just like, well, it's, you know, it references rivers, it's about a river, it's about a bitch, we'll call it Bitch River, and I'll just give it that title. And then I shared it with a lovely group of poetry friends headed by Sarah Doyle, and they were very generous and very kind about the poem, but they said, no, that's the title, that's got to be the title. And I was like, really? But it was kind of like a joke, and they're like, no, it's the title. So yeah, that's the story behind that poem, and then it was published in Propel and in the Propel anthology as well. So Bitch River is bitchin' on. Bitch River. My body is a river in recovery from another body. We're all just out here trying our best, but some people's best is fucking awful, and that's not my fault. I am exhausted. The sun cannot set in the same river twice, or something. I adore how its pink flesh pollutes the river's mummy flesh. Like that time on holiday as a kid when I was so sick, all that came up was rot and algae, bile and silt. Silt, the dark rind of a dagger so eroded it was a mistranslation, a misunderstanding, the slit in my side. Is my body property? Help me. I need to change all the batteries in all the smoke alarms and chandeliers. The realtors are coming. I don't want them to notice the water damage, the low ground, the predictability of living on a floodplain.
Who are your poetry and writing inspirations from the past and present?
I think from the past it would be, you know, Frank O'Hara, Elizabeth Bishop, Sylvia Plath. I know it might be a cliche to say Sylvia Plath, but it's a cliche because it's true. And Edward Thomas, of course, as I've already mentioned. I think from the present, oh gosh, there's so many. Cynthia Miller and Stephen Sexton have to be up there. Chen Chen, I've already mentioned. I have so much love for Chen Chen. Mary Jean Chan, Rachel Long, Rachel Allen, Nina Mingya-Pals. They've just announced her second collection, and I'm so excited to get my mitts on it. Yeah, there's so many wonderful poets out there at the moment. It's just such an exciting time. Well, I think it's always an exciting time for poetry, isn't it? There's so much going on and being written. Dana Smith. Oh, I read and reviewed Them by Harry Josephine Giles. Oh my God, it's so good. Like the poems are amazing, they make you feel, they really do. But then it's also about the forms that she's using on the page, and it reminds me kind of Paris the Poem by Hope Malise in that sense, that it is this bold exploration of form and kind of really challenging what a poem can be, what a poem is, and what is the best way for a poem to translate experience. It's just, yeah, amazing, amazing work. Oh, and Mules of Love by Ellen Bass is a collection that I read recently that is just so soft and sumptuous and beautiful. Yeah, roses. I want to know more about roses. I want to be given a rose, a yellow rose. I want to be given a rose by the kind of person who always carries secateurs, and they're giving it to me just because they've read this poem about my wanting to know more about roses. Their etymology. I want it tucked into my hair. I have no interest in hair, apart from Kate Winslet's hair in Titanic, when she takes out that jewelled comb and shakes her hair down over her shoulders like a French girl, or her almost boyfriend sketch of a French girl. I suppose it symbolises her emancipation or something. Maybe I should say I don't care about roses apart from Rose in Titanic. I've always felt that Titanic was a bit of a prologue, like, what does Rose do next? Where does she go? I hope she mastered spitting not like a man, but like herself. I hope she spat herself dry. I hope she spat into many mouths and lived long enough to play The Sims, to make herself and Jack on The Sims, and watch him teach their improbably gorgeous, pixelated children how to walk. And at the very end, is old Rose dead in Titanic heaven, kissing Jack on that grand staircase, whilst her husband is up in normal heaven, watching like the rest of us, thinking, dude, what the fuck? What the actual fuck?
In terms of poetry, are you working on something presently?
So I suppose the big thing at the moment is my PhD. I'm very lucky because it is 50% critical, 50% creative. So I do have the time and the luxury to say, you know, I've got to spend this amount of time on writing poems, which is really nice. I've got a manuscript that I'm kind of working on and polishing, and because, you know, a collection is the dream, isn't it? It's I guess what the ultimate goal would be, but I think the PhD at the moment is sort of the big thing.
Diolch yn fawr, Ellora. It's been such a pleasure talking to you and finding out about your poetry, your writing inspirations. Thank you.
Thank you.